Now we're going to be looking at Keats' Ode to a Nightingale. There are a couple of things that will be useful to know as we approach the poem. The first thing it will be useful to know is what a nightingale represents in Greek mythology. And remember that Keats and his readers who were well educated would be very familiar with Greek mythology. In Greek mythology, the nightingale was a woman, Philomel, who was viciously attacked, had her tongue cut out, and then was turned into this bird by the gods and made immortal. Philomel, the nightingale, is an immortal bird who is singing to the mortal poet. The second thing it will be useful to know before we get into the poem is that this poem begins as a response to the poet hearing the song of the bird. So the poet is sitting in the evening at dusk as the sun is going down, or at twilight after the sun has gone down, sitting outside and hears the song of the bird coming out of a group of beech trees. The poem itself becomes a response to the poet's emotional state after hearing the song of the bird and his attempt to regain that emotional state again.
At the beginning of the poem, we see the title, obviously, Ode to a Nightingale. Always pay attention to titles. The titles are not just throwaways filling in a blank. Writers and poets pay careful attention to the title because it is something that guides the reader to what they should know or be paying attention to in the poem. And in this particular case, this is Ode to a Nightingale, which means that it is an address to the nightingale. This is the poetic trope known as apostrophe. An apostrophe is an address to an abstract or absent object, or in this case, a poetic object with whom you cannot expect to have a conversation because the nightingale is not going to talk back, even if the nightingale could hear him because the nightingale is actually away from the poet in a stand of trees. So you do want to pay attention to the title because it's going to guide you to what you should be paying attention in the poem. All right, as we mentioned earlier, this poem is a response to the feeling created by hearing the song of the nightingale emanating from a stand of beech trees, a melodious plot of beech and green. Over the course of this poem, the poet is going to attempt to regain the initial state of ecstasy that he experienced on hearing the song of the nightingale. So we have the first stanza, and this would be a stanza because it is a regular 10-line stanza following a set format throughout the poem, which is typical of an ode. My heart aches, and a drowsy numbness pains my sense as though of hemlock I had drunk, or emptied some dull opiate to the drains 1 minute past, and lethe words had sunk. 'Tis not through envy of thy happy lot, but being too happy in thine happiness, that thou, light-winged dryad of the trees, in some melodious plot of beech and green and shadows numberless, singest of summer and full-throated ease. Okay, so what is the poet's initial feeling on hearing the song of the nightingale? We'll come back in a moment and address the implied meanings of aches and pains. Clearly there is something painful about this sensation because you can't use the words aches and pains or the idea of drinking hemlock without suggesting that there is something uncomfortable. But his initial sense is of drowsy numbness, which pains his sense. In this particular case, which means pains his senses. This sense refers to the senses, the sight and sound and smell. So his senses are being numbed by this, as though of hemlock I had drunk. All right, hemlock is a famous poison, famous because Socrates died as the result of a state-ordered suicide. Socrates was offered the choice of either drinking hemlock or having his heart ripped out. And obviously of those two, drinking hemlock is a much less painful way of dying. And in fact, hemlock is a neurotoxin. So what it does is it initially deprives your senses. It creates this sense of euphoria. And then eventually it shuts down the nervous responses that control your heart. And so your heart stops beating and you stop breathing. But it creates an initial sense of euphoria. So his initial feeling is his senses are being numbed with a state of euphoria. which is something that we had described before in Wordsworth's poem as a sense of ecstasy. Remember that ecstasy is this sort of out-of-body experience. So he has a drowsy numbness painting a sense of those hemlock he had drunk, or emptied some dull opiate to the drains 1 minute past. So 1 minute ago, he completely drank down a bottle of dull opiate. I'm sure I don't need to explain what a dull opiate is. As we mentioned when we talked about Coleridge, that the most common painkiller of the time was laudanum, which is opium dissolved in alcohol. So, especially as a doctor, he would be familiar with laudanum and the effects of opium. To the drains means bottoms up. He completely drank it down. The references to winemaking. The drains is the residue left in the bottom of a wine cask when you pour the wine off. It's also known more familiarly to us as dregs. So when you make wine, you macerate the grapes, which means you crush them, and then you put them in a barrel, and then the yeast reacts with the sugar to create alcohol, and then you let it sit to age in a barrel. And after you've let it age sufficiently, you pop the bung, the cork that holds the barrel closed, and you pour the wine off to be filtered, but you pour it off very carefully so that you don't disturb the dregs or the drains that have settled to the bottom of the barrel. And I'm sure you've heard the term shocking a wine. What shocking a wine means is that you shake the bottle in some way. You give it a sharp blow or you shake it, and the drains, the dregs, get put up into the body of the wine, and it gives the wine a really bricky, dry taste. And so you want to make sure that you don't shake up the wine. So when they pour the wine out of the cask, they're very careful not to shake the wine so they get off the wine and leave the dregs or the drains in the bottom. So in this poem, emptied to the drains means poured all completely off, so all that's left in the bottom is the dregs. And Lethe words has sunk. Lethe is the river that bounds Hades. If you read the Odyssey, you'll remember that Telemachus has to go down and find out what happened to his father, and he has to go down to Hades and talk to the dead Greek heroes. And when he goes down there, the heroes can't remember who they are because they have drunk from the water of the Lethe. And so he has to sacrifice a goat and let them drink the goat's blood, and that restores their memory. And then he gets this long, sad story of the Trojan heroes, of the Greek heroes of the Trojan War, and finds out what happened to his father. So Lethe words means he has been drinking from the water Lethe, which means he is engaging in a sense of self-forgetfulness. So his sense is being numbed as though he had drunk of neurotoxin or emptied some dull opiates that had made him forget himself. So he's in this state of euphoria or ecstasy where he has begun to forget himself. So why has this experience caused him to engage in this case of self-forgetfulness? He tells us, "'Tis not through envy of thy happy lot, but being too happy in thine happiness." He says, it's not because I envy your happy lot, not because I envy your happiness, but because I have identified with your happiness too completely. He is too happy in the happiness of the nightingale. In other words, envy is a sense of jealousy. It's when someone else is experiencing something that you can't. And he says it's not from envy. It's because he is identified so completely with the nightingale's happiness. So he is overjoyed. He is in a state of extreme bliss that is causing this euphoria or ecstasy from listening to the nightingale's song. And the reason is that thou, light-winged dryad of the trees, a dryad is a wood nymph. So the nightingale is like a spirit of the trees. And literally you can't see the nightingale. It's hidden in a stand of beech trees, so he can't see it. So all he does is hear its voice. In some melodious plot of beechen green, beech trees they're obviously beech trees, and a plot is a grove. So the song of the bird is emanating from this plot of beech trees, which has now become melodious because the song is emanating from it. And shadows numberless. So even though the bird is in this plot of beech trees and surrounded by shadows, is still able to singest of summer in full-throated ease. So the bird, caught up in the shadows of the trees, is still able to sing with joy of summer, and the poet has become caught up in the bird's song of joy and has identified it with so completely that he has become lifted out of himself in this sort of ecstasy. Now, we do need to go back and consider why he says aches and pains. I don't think we can ignore aches and pains in this poem, because aches and pains associates painfulness. But I think that what he's getting to is that this is always sort of an ambiguous state. Extreme joy is often associated with a sort of painful sense, especially extreme joy that lifts one out of oneself. So this sense is pleasurable, but it's pleasurable almost to the point of pain, where the two senses are converging in some way. But it's also painful perhaps for another reason. And if you've ever experienced this kind of sense of extreme joy, one of the things that you know is that you're also aware at the time you're experiencing it that it's temporary, that it's going to end, and that he's going to eventually lose this sense of ecstasy, which is what happens in the second stanza. In the second stanza, he wants to go back to that initial state of ecstasy that he enjoyed in the previous stanza. Oh, for a draught of vintage that hath been cooled a long age in the deep delved earth, tasting the flora and the country green, dance and provincial song and sunburnt mirth. Oh, for a beaker full of the warm south, full of the true, the blushful hippocrene, with beaded bubbles winking at the brim and purple-stained mouth, that I might drink and leave the world unseen, and with thee fade away into the forest dim. So, what's he trying to achieve? What he's trying to achieve is reassociate himself with a bird, re-identify with the bird, that I might drink and leave the world unseen, and with thee fade away into the forest dim. So how does he hope he's going to accomplish this? Well, he says he wants a draft. Draft comes from the idea that you draw from a tap. You draw the wine from a tap. Oh, for a draft of vintage. And vintage, of course, as we're told over here in the side, is wine. That have been cooled a long age in the deep delved earth, tasting of flora in the country green, dance and provincial song, and sunburnt mirth. So what kind of wine does he specifically want? Well, jokingly, one could say that he wants a white wine. It's cooled a long age in the deep delved earth. You serve white wine chilled, tasting of the flora in the country green. So it tastes of flowers in the green country, which would suggest a chilled white wine. But seriously, what he's looking for is that it tastes of flora in the country green, dance and provincial song, and sunburnt mirth. What he's referring to is a pastoral wine. Now, the pastoral convention, as we have mentioned before, is a convention that looks at rural country life as this carefree, happy, untroubled life. The pastoral world is a world occupied by shepherds and shepherdesses who look after sheep, but because there are no predators and there's no winter and there's no age and there's no death and there's no sickness, they really don't have very much to do but sit around all day and make out and play music and enjoy nature. The pastoral world is a timeless world where there is no worry about death or no worry about disease or hunger or any of the troubles in the real world. And it's inhabited by a group of conventional characters who are given names like Corin and Flora and Phillida. Shakespeare actually invokes this world very often in things like As You Like It. So what he's looking for is he's looking for a wine that will take him away to this carefree pastoral world, tasting of flora in the country green, dance and provincial song and sunburnt mirth. So his first hope is a wine, a draft of vintage, that will allow him to escape the world that he occupies, which is characterized by pain and death, which he will refer to specifically in the next stanza. The next lines say, Oh, for a beaker full of the warm south, full of the true, the blushful hippocrene, with beaded bubbles winking at the brim. And so this has got to be a sparkling red wine. Red wine is typically served at room temperature, the warm south. But it also, of course, refers to the pastoral world. But the hippocrene is the fountain of the muses. And the muses, of course, are the demigods that are responsible for poetic inspiration. He is longing for a wine that will invest him with poetic inspiration. And why does he want the wine that will bring him to this pastoral bliss and to this poetic inspiration? And the purpose of those wines is that he might drink and escape back into the sense of euphoria which allows him to identify with the bird and with the bird fade away into the forest dim. Now, before we move away from this stanza, I want to call your attention to one more thing. Keats is a master of rhythm and meter. And one of the ways that poets use rhythm and meter is to speed up or slow down your progress through the lines of the poem. So a melancholy poem will have difficult, convoluted meter that causes you to slow down to read it. And a happy, cheerful poem will use a very quick, regular, like an iambic metrical arrangement in order to move you quickly through the lines. And you'll notice that in this poem, Keats varies the speed of the lines with the meter so that happy stanzas move fairly quickly. And in this line, he uses both the meter, the regular meter, but also the alliteration, right? The alliteration is the repetition of initial consonants in words in a line. And so that line moves very quickly. He's literally talking about the bubbles in the sparkling wine popping, but the line itself sort of sparkles and pops with beaded bubbles winking at the brim. He's also using assonance in this line. Assonance is the repetition of vowel sounds with different consonant sounds surrounding them. So wink and brim is an example of assonance. So he's using these sound arrangements in order to make the line move quickly. And then the next line, with beaded bubbles winking at the brim and purple stained mouth, it slows us down, that I might drink and leave the world unseen, and with thee fade away into the forest dim. So he speeds the line up for the happy moment and then slows it down for the more melancholy. The next stanza will express why he wants to escape with the bird into the forest and away from the world that he occupies, because the world that he occupies is a mortal world characterized by suffering and trouble. Fade far away, dissolve, and quite forget what thou among the leaves hast never known, the weariness, the fever, and the fret, here where men sit and hear each other groan, where palsy shakes a few sad last gray hairs, where youth grows pale and spectre thin and dies, where but to think is to be full of sorrow and leaden-eyed despairs, where beauty cannot keep her lustrous eyes, or new love pine at them beyond tomorrow. So the world he occupies, the one that he's trying to escape into the pastoral world from, is a world that's characterized by the weariness, the fever, and the fret that the nightingale, because the nightingale, remember, is immortal, has never known. The world of mortality and illness, here where men sit and hear each other groan, where palsy shakes a few sad last gray hairs. And you'll notice that this line is actually palsied. Palsy is that shaking that comes with old age, where old people's nervous system starts to break down and their hands shake. And in this particular case, this line shakes with palsy, where youth grows pale and spectre thin and dies. And this pale and spectre thin and dies is a very accurate description of what happens to people who die from tuberculosis. And Keats at this point does not yet know that he's going to have tuberculosis. He doesn't find out to the following year. But he has watched his mother and brother die of tuberculosis. And he does have a sense of his own mortality. Remember that he's a doctor and he's watched people die. And so when you have tuberculosis, what happens is the bacteria literally eat your lungs away. And because your lungs can't process oxygen into your bloodstream, your body is unable to metabolize food because you don't have enough oxygen in your blood. And so you literally starve, you waste away. Tuberculosis was often called consumption because your body is being consumed by it and grows pale and spectre thin and dies. Where but to think is to be full of sorrow and leaden-eyed despairs, where beauty cannot keep her lustrous eyes because of age and illness, or new love pine at them beyond tomorrow. So new love is in this world tainted by mortality and illness. So he's trying to escape into the immortal pastoral world of the nightingale from the mortal world characterized by illness and death. Away, away, for I will fly to thee, not charioted by Bacchus and his pards, but on the viewless wings of poesy, though the dull brain perplexes and retards. Already with thee, tender is the night, and haply the queen moon is on her throne, clustered around by all her starry fays. But here there is no light, save what from heaven is with the breezes blown through verdurous glooms and winding mossy ways. So in this stanza, he is trying to rejoin with the nightingale, not charioted by Bacchus and his pards. Okay, Bacchus is the god of wine. He's probably glossed below as the god of wine, but he's actually the god of partying. And Bacchus is the god who travels on a chariot drawn by leopards. Leopards in Keats's time was often abbreviated to pards. So he's not joining the nightingale being drawn in the chariot of wine, but rather on the viewless wings of poesy. And poesy, the original root word of poetry, is poesis, the Greek word, which means poetry is poesis. And during Keats's time, the word poesy and poetry were interchangeable, although poesy often was used to refer to art in general, though the dull brain perplexes and retards. And it's really interesting how this line works, because remember, he's a master of sound and meter and rhythm. And he's saying, already with thee I will fly to thee, not charioted by Bacchus and his pards, not drawn by wine, but on the viewless wings of poesy. And then immediately he runs into the problem of his dull brain. And if you try to say this line fast, try to say a line fast with L's, B's, and R's, and P's and R's next to each other. And so the line literally trips over itself. Though the dull brain perplexeth and retard, it's hard to say that line. So now he's imagining himself already identified with the bird and in that world of shadows numberless, in the beech and green, the melodious plot of beech and green. And he says, already with thee, tender is the night, and haply, remember haply means not happily, but perhaps. And perhaps the queen moon is on her throne, and he's referring to the moon as the queen. The moon obviously is associated in Greek and Latin mythology with Diana. So perhaps the queen moon is on her throne, clustered around by all her starry fays. Fays are fairies. So he's imagining the moon as the queen, and she's surrounded by her courtiers, who are the stars, who are also fairies. But he's with the bird in the plot of beech and green. But here there is no light, save what from heaven is with the breezes blown through verdurous glooms and winding mossy ways. So he's in the trees, in the dense forest with the bird, and there's no light. So perhaps the queen is on her throne, the queen moon is on her throne, and there's stars in the sky, but where I am with the bird, there is no light. When he's with the bird in his imagination, in the plot of beech and green, he can't see because it's dark. I cannot see what flowers are at my feet, nor what soft incense hangs upon the boughs, but in embalmed darkness guess each sweet wherewith the seasonable month endows the grass, the thicket, and the fruit tree wild, white hawthorn and the pastoral eglantine, fast fading violets covered up with leaves, and mid-May's eldest child, the coming muskrose full of dewy wine, the murmurous haunt of flies on summer eves. In the world of the forest, in the dark world, the plot of beech and green, he can't see because there's no light, but here there is no light. So he has to guess the flowers that are surrounding him by their smells. He says he can't see the flowers or what soft incense, which would be the flowers which hang from the tree limbs, but in embalmed darkness, and over here it tells us that embalmed means perfumed, guess each sweet that the seasonable month endows. So he's guessing the different plants that are surrounding them from their smells. The grass, the thicket, the fruit tree wild, the hawthorn, the pastoral eglantine, the fast fading violets covered up in leaves, and the coming muskrose full of dewy wine. So he's smelling the scents that surround him in the darkened forest where the bird has taken him. But I want you to notice a couple of things that are implicit here. The editors gloss embalmed as perfumed, which is a legitimate gloss. But of course, we can't think of embalming without thinking of funereal preparations of a corpse. And that's literally what happens. Sorry to be so graphic, but when they embalm a corpse, they pump out the bodily fluids and pump in perfumed liquid as a preservative so that the body won't decay and smell bad. So embalming, even though it means perfumed, it also has an unavoidable association with death. And then, of course, we have the fast fading violets being buried by the leaves, fast fading. And then we have the mid-May's eldest child, the musk rose, which is just blooming, full of dewy wine, the murmurous haunt of flies on summer eves. And of course, flies are associated with dead bodies as well. So even though he has imaginatively engaged with the bird in its world, a pastoral, immortal world, he can't escape his implicit awareness of his own mortality, which is hidden within this notion of embalming incense, fast fading violets, and the murmurous haunt of flies. And that awareness brings us to the next stanza. He says, "Darkling I listen, and for many a time I have been half in love with easeful death, called him soft names in many a mused rhyme to take into the air my quiet breath. Now more than ever seems it rich to die, to cease upon the midnight with no pain, while thou art pouring forth thy soul abroad in such an ecstasy. Still wouldst thou sing, and I have ears in vain, to thy high requiem become a sod." All right, so darkling I listen. We're told over here that it's in darkness, but also darkling has this participle, this present participle at the end. Ing is usually used to form the present participle. So it sort of suggests in increasing darkness he listens. And his awareness of his own mortality and the growing darkness, he listens to the bird's song, and this reminds him that he has been half in love with easeful death. Easeful death, I don't think he's using that word by accident, to take into the air my quiet breath. Well, remember, he watched his brother die of tuberculosis, and his mother as well. And when one dies of tuberculosis, one coughs up blood constantly as your lungs are eaten away. It's hard to avoid the notion that a quiet death as opposed to the horrid hacking death of someone who dies of tuberculosis. So now more than ever it seems rich to die, to have an easeful death with quiet breath, to cease upon the midnight with no pain, to just end rather than to waste away. He's aware of the fact that he must die as opposed to the immortal nightingale, which will live forever. And the next 4 lines show his awareness of that difference. While thou art pouring forth thy soul abroad in such an ecstasy. So remember that an ecstasy is an out-of-body experience. It's when your soul leaves your body. The bird is pouring forth its soul. Well, how is it pouring forth its soul? It's pouring forth its soul in song. That's a common cliche when one is singing, especially singing very emotionally. They're pouring forth their soul in song. The bird is pouring forth its soul in song in such an ecstasy. So its soul is being pushed out of its body in song in this form of ecstasy. But of course, it's different between the bird and the poet, because the bird is immortal. It can pour forth its soul endlessly, and nothing happens. But what happens when the poet pours forth his soul, literally? Well, he dies. He would cease upon the midnight with no pain, while the bird is pouring forth thy soul, as opposed to his soul. Still wouldst thou sing, and I have ears in vain, to thy high requiem. And here it says a mass for the dead, but actually a requiem is a funeral song. And so the bird's song, ironically, becomes a funeral song for the poet, who has become a sod. And I'm sure you're familiar with the term sod, meaning a plot of grass. And it's actually, in this particular case, it is a metonymy. Metonymy is the trope where something associated with something else in practice becomes representative of it. So if you say, today the White House announced, well, the White House is associated with a presidential administration. So it's not that this large limestone building started talking, but the presidential administration housed within the White House started talking. The pen is mightier than the sword. Pen is associated with writing and with reason. The sword is associated with warfare and violence. So they're saying writing and reason is stronger than warfare and violence. If only that were true. So in this particular case, what is a sod? Well, a sod is associated obviously with a grave. Because when you're buried, especially when you're buried in Keats' time, what they did was they dig a big hole in the ground 6 feet deep. They take all the dirt, and they throw the dirt in a pile. They put the coffin in. Then they throw the dirt back in, and they pile it up high. So there's a mound of dirt. because as the coffin decays and the body decays, it will collapse. And if you don't throw all the dirt in, when it collapses, there's going to be a hole in the ground, which is going to cause all sorts of trip and fall problems, and your lawyers will get involved. So what happens is you have this little mound of dirt, and as in England, where it rains a lot, that dirt will quickly be covered with grass. And so you have a sod represents the grave. So the poet just simply becomes a lump of green grass in the ground, as opposed to the nightingale, who is immortal and can go on singing forever. So as the nightingale pours forth his soul abroad in such an ecstasy, the nightingale's song becomes a funeral song, a requiem for the poet who has simply become a mound of green dirt in the ground. Which then, of course, takes us to the next stanza. Because the bird is immortal, thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. No hungry generations tread thee down. The voice I hear this passing night was heard in ancient days by emperor and clown. Perhaps the self-same song that found a path through the sad heart of Ruth, when sick for home she stood in tears amid the alien corn. The same that ofttimes hath charmed magic casements, opening on the foam of perilous seas, in fairylands forlorn. Forlorn, the very word is like a bell to toll me back from thee to my soul's self. The idea in the 6th verse paragraph that the bird's immortal song will go on after the poet is dead then creates the comparison here between the poet and the bird. Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird, as the poet was born for death, because all immortal things are born to die. No hungry generations, the future generations, don't tread thee down. The voice I hear this passing night, that is, of course, the voice of the nightingale, was heard in ancient days by emperor and clown, because the nightingale is immortal. The same bird has been singing for generations. The poet is listening to the same song that people in the past have listened to. And perhaps it's the very same song that found a path through the sad heart of Ruth. And this is, Ruth is a biblical story of a traditionally sad woman. In fact, the word Ruth has become a word which means lamenting sadness. When sick for home she stood in tears amid the alien corn. The same that ofttimes hath charmed magic casements, opening on the foam of perilous seas and fairylands forlorn. It's the same song that's been heard by ancient emperors, by the biblical Ruth. The same that ofttimes hath charmed magic casements. What's a casement? Well, it's glossed here. A casement is glossed as a window. And that's true. The carpenters still call windows casements. It's a double-hung casement is a window that can be opened from the top or the bottom. What has happened here is the poet has managed to imaginatively identify with the word and escape briefly into the immortal world of the bird. He is now imagining himself with ancient emperors and with Ruth. So the bird song has become this magic window. I think of Peter Pan and the window that he flies through to get to Never Never Land. The bird song has charmed the magic casement, opening on the foam of perilous seas, which of course also suggests sort of Peter Pan, in fairylands forlorn. And then he says, forlorn, he repeats it again. The very word is like a bell to toll me back from thee to my soul's self. So how is the word forlorn like a bell? This is actually a brilliant moment in the poem. What is a tolling bell? So in order to explain this, I have to explain a little bit of my own past. When I was in high school and as an undergraduate in college, I worked as the weekend custodian in a church. Actually, it was at that point Community Presbyterian Church. It is now Laguna Presbyterian Church. If you're familiar with Laguna, it is the one on the corner of 2nd Street and Forest. My job was I was the weekend custodian, and so one of my jobs was on Sunday mornings to ring the bells to get people to go into the service. And if you have romantic images of me like the Hunchback of Notre Dame climbing up into the bell tower and swinging from bell ropes, unfortunately I have a sad revelation. The bells in Laguna Presbyterian Church, which you can still hear ringing at the hour in downtown Laguna, are actually not mechanical bells but electronic. And they were even back when I was in high school. They had a thing called a carillon. And it was an electronic device that sat up in the bell tower, even though now they actually have a bell hanging there. When I was there, they didn't even have a bell. They just had great big speakers. And you flip a switch, and it makes the bell sounds ring. You can turn a dial to select what sound you want the bells to make, and there were 4 choices. The first choice is ring, and ring is simply a repeated, steady beat. Bong, bong, bong. That is the sound that you make in order to call people into the church service. So they're out on the lawn drinking their morning coffee before the church service. You make this ringing sound. It tells people to get their butts into the pews because the service is about to start. The second one is swing. And swing is when the bells just ring wildly to celebrate something. I cannot remember for the life of me what the third one was. But the fourth sound was tolling bells. When do you toll a bell? You toll a bell at a funeral for whom the bell tolls. And the tolling sound are two equal sounds with a pause in between. Bong, 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 bong. This sound of a tolling bell is a perfect example of a spondee, a two-syllable metrical foot where both syllables get the same accent, the same amount of emphasis. Bong, bong, forlorn. Forlorn is a spondee. So we have both syllables get the same amount of emphasis. Poet is able to escape for just a moment into the imaginative world of the immortal nightingale and is imagining the foam of perilous seas in fairylands, and then he finds the wrong word, forlorn. He hears the spondee and he thinks of tolling bells, which remind him of his mortality. So the very word is like a bell to toll me back from thee to my soul self. He loses his identification with the bird and is thrown back to his own limited mortal existence. And so at that point, he bids the bird adieu, tells the bird goodbye as the bird goes away. Because the fancy, remember the fancy is imagination, cannot cheat so well as she is famed to do, deceiving elf. His imagination was not sufficient to help him escape his own mortality into the imaginative world of the bird for more than just a moment. Adieu, adieu, thy plaintive anthem fades past the near meadows, over the still stream, up the hillside, and now 'tis buried deep in the next valley glades. So the bird flies off, flies over the meadows, over the stream, up the hill, and then goes into the next valley. The poet is left now alone in his soul self, and he's left even in a state of uncertainty. He's not certain what just happened to him. Was it a vision or a waking dream? Well, what's a vision? A vision is often, that word is often associated with prophetic moments of insight, where you actually have a vision that's granted from without. So a vision is prophetic. A waking dream, on the other hand, is a daydream. Was it actually a prophetic vision, or was it simply a mistaken daydream? Fled is that music. Do I wake or sleep? And he's left in this sort of liminal state. A liminal state, a limen, literally in Latin, is a threshold. We'll talk about this again when we talk about Jane Eyre. He's left in this liminal state, which is this threshold state between two uncertain circumstances. Is he awake or was he sleeping? Was this a vision or a daydream? Did this really happen to him or did he just imagine it? And so he's left lost, caught in his own mortal world, confused about the reality of what he just experienced. So this poem is the poet beginning by experiencing this moment of out-of-body ecstasy through the imaginative identification with the immortal nightingale. And then the rest of the poem is him attempting to recapture this identification with the nightingale, which he can never do for more than an instant, but he's always thrown back to his own mortal self with his awareness of his mortality that limits his ability to become the imaginative immortal bird. Now, in the next video, we're going to be looking at Ode on a Grecian Urn, and we're going to be talking about a more successful attempt to use art to escape the awareness of mortality.